Hello, it's game 4 of Grand Prix Leg 3, Group A, and it's Hikaru Nakamura against Levon Aronian. Aronian is leading at this moment with 2 points out of 3 games, and he would be happy with a draw against Hikaru. So let's see what happens in this game. Hikaru lost the first match between the two of them. And he begins with e4, and Aronian chose to play Berlin. Knight f6, and now d3. Typically, white does that when he doesn't want to does this whole boring stuff in the Berlin. Let's say if he doesn't want to castle and to allow capture on e4, which either leads to the endgame after this, very known endgame, and so on, or just to go rook e1 and after going back to d6 to take on e5 and to have something like this, which is also quite drawish and doesn't look like something that is very ambitious for white. So he chose to play something else, to play d3, and now bishop c5 by Levon, c3 by Hikaru, and now Levon could have just gone for a castle or just played d6, but he played d5 here. He tries to strike in the center and to use the fact that nobody is guarding the d5 square, but you might ask yourself what happens if knight captures e5, because it's a free pawn, right? So in that case, what happens is that black just castles short side, and now the king is safe on the black side. White is still not castled and his knight is under attack. So what happens now? If white captures on c6, you take it, and if you take on c6, then there is bishop f2. Quite nice tactical trick. And if king takes, knight g4, after which the king has to choose where to go, but wherever it goes, let's say it goes to g1, then you can combine attacking the bishop and threatening checkmate by queen f6. Now you want this, and also to capture on c6. So actually, after capturing on e5 and castling, it seems like white has to give up the pawn back. So in this position, white took on d5, queen takes, and now bishop c4, and we have some kind of Italian, I would say, something that resembles of that with the early d5. Queen d6 back, and now Hikaru just develops, castles, and now, as usually goes when the bishop is on c5, it's time to expand on the queen side and to go b4, bishop b6, and now Hikaru also finishes development with castling, bishop f5, attacking d3, and now queen c2. And now it's a question, how does black continue in this situation? I think the optimal way to go here is to go with this rook on d8 to attack on d3, and to go with this rook from f8 to e8 to protect the pawn on e5. And first black goes with this rook a d8, attacking the d3 pawn, and now it's not easy to defend this pawn. You can go knight e4, but that could just lead to a trade after this, and bishop g4, let's say. And I think that black is really fine here. Doesn't have much problems here. So he has to find the other way to deal with this threat, and he goes for a4 at this moment. And now the point is, after bishop d3, let's say if you capture on d3, I take, rook takes. Now there is a5 and the bishop is just trapped. Black can take a couple of pawns for this piece, but it's not quite good. So what can black do? Black did a5, trying to stop this expansion. He could have gone also with a6, but with a5 he's forcing matters, and now white has to go b5, and the bishop stays relatively safe, and also the c5 square becomes more weak. So now the black knight goes to e7, and now queen a2, escaping this potential pin, but still it keeps the d3 pawn under attack. And now black attacks 3 times, while white does it only once, defends only once. For example, here, if you try bishop a3, this just leads to simplifications after bishop c5. Let's say takes, rook fe1 and knight g6, and black is fine. He's defending e5, and he might even put pressure on the d3 pawn later on in the game. So after knight e7, he went for this move. And you might ask yourself, or me, why not capture on d3 right now? Well, if you do that, there is this move. And now the queen is overloaded by defending the knight on e7 and the bishop on d3. For example, if you go here, there is this move. And then if queen takes, bishop e7, and black is a piece down. So, and also slight issues with the rook on d8 and f8. So black has to play something like this. But now we don't capture on c5 straight away, because after this, then the rook captures and the black is just a pawn up. But we go different. We take on d3, and now if queen takes, bishop c5, so bishop a3 has to be played, but now white just steps aside by bishop c2. When the bishop goes back to c5, which it must happen, then we have knight c4, and we attack both a5 and also e5. So after this, knight a5, b7 is under attack as well. And also when you exchange queens, let's say after this, now both pawns are under attack, and it's simply not good. White ends up being a pawn up after this. So black just refrains from capturing on d3 and goes knight g6. Bishop a3 by Hikaru, and now bishop c5. He must do it because the exchange is taken otherwise. The f8 rook is hanging, so Levon took, queen c5, and now it's time to make d3 advanced, because d3 is such a weakness that it's not worth it to just defend it all the time, to play something passive like knight e1, when black at least has knight f4 to continue putting pressure on d3. So now it was time to push d4, and now black waits with capture on d4, and he went for queen d6. If he took on d4, well, you might even capture with the knight, but after cd, you might have something similar to what happened in the game. After queen d6, and black would play knight d5, and eventually white would capture on d5. So it could lead to something what happened in the game. So Levon tries to keep tension in the center by queen d6, and now rook fe1. Nakamura tries to put pressure on e5, and in that way to force black to capture on d4, which is what happened, because what else to play? Rook on f8 is tied to defending the f7 pawn. This rook doesn't really want to play to go to e8 and also to trap this rook. it has its purpose on the d file, so that was maybe the logic of Levon in this position. ED, CD, and now knight d5. The pawn on d5 is isolated, and black tries to stop it, to block it somehow. And this was the time to capture on d5, capture, 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 and in this position, it seems like black is doing fine. The d4 pawn is a weakness. In the endgame, weaknesses are usually well used against your opponent, and there is one issue with black's position, and that issue is the c7 pawn and also this pawn on a5. Those two pawns are also weaknesses, and it's not easy to deal with them. So in this position, Nakamura plays knight c4 straight away, attacking the a5 pawn, but also threatening knight e3 to double attack the rook and the bishop. And by that move, white would just capture the exchange, because the rook cannot keep defending the bishop on f5, and the bishop would have to get to e6, let's say, and to give the rook up. So yeah, after b6, knight e3, and black would just be an exchange down. So here black went for bishop g4, giving up the a5 pawn, but in the return black ruins the pawn structure of white. So Hikaru took on a5, and first Levon plays b6, but I think the cleaner way to equalize here was to take on f3 first, and after gf to go c6, using the pin on the 5th rank. Now it's impossible to capture because of rook takes a5, so the b5 pawn is in that case very, very endangered. And what to do? If you take on b7 like this, then cb. And the material gets so reduced that it's impossible, not impossible, but very tough for white to convert the extra pawn. He can take on b5, but I'm not sure about the whole thing after, let's say, rook b5, knight c5, and just knight f4 or something else. And the d pawn is becoming very tough to push. Once black makes some luft by g6 or h6, he would put pressure on the d4 pawn, and who knows, he might even play for a win because of the weakened king side. So maybe after cb, the only chance to play for a win, for something at least, is to make the a pawn passed. And after rook a8, I don't know, to go a6 and then to take on d4. And after that, the a pawn might seem scary, but you have to attack the rook on a8 to make it a queen. So I think it's not very, very promising for white. So let's go back. Here b6 was played by Levon instead of capturing on f3. Now Hikaru plays knight c6, and only now he takes on f3, gf, and like I said, he has to make some luft before his rooks can become more active. He plays h6, and now white has an issue. He's a pawn up. That's not an issue. His issue is that his knight on c6 is tied to this pawn on d4. And also his pawn structure in general is very, very soft, let's say, at best. His d4 pawn is weak, his kingside pawns don't even get me started on this. It's just terrible. and it seems like white is getting stuck in this position, but he tries to improve with rook ac1, trying to get rook c4 to defend the pawn and somehow to liberate his knight from c6. Levon plays king h7 and now rook c4, trying to make the room for his knight to jump to somewhere, 97, 95, whatever. And now Levon plays rook g5 check, and now not to be so passive, to go king h1 and allow something like knight f4, and black would still have some, not some, but good chances to survive because of the passive position of the opponent's king. So also it's an endgame, so it's much more important to activate the king, and what's the better way than to go king f1, maybe to at some point go king e2. But now Levon plays rook h5, he uses the absence of the king and tries to attack the h2 pawn. And now if you go back, he goes back and he's happy with the draw, so there's no damage for Levon. So Hikaru has to pull the trigger, and he just chose to give up this pawn, and he went for 97. He's countering the attack on h2 by attacking on c7, and Levon took. Now rook e4 to stop knight f4 from being played, and now he gave a check, king g2, and now Levon plays rook a1 here. I think here it's better to play rook d1 to just take the control over d pawn immediately. And if white captures on c7, to go f5. And now the only move for white which makes sense is to just take on g6, because if you go back to e3, then this knight becomes very annoying, and I think in the end it becomes perpetual. Also, you lose the d4 pawn, so it's not very promising. So I think here knight takes, king takes, and if this happens to take on d4, you lose the g pawn, but I think the worst has happened. The d pawn is taken, and now white again has to create a passed pawn, which will be very tough. Not very tough, but very tough to convert. Let's say after rook g3, you can go king e5, and after this, now black has the h pawn, which is passed, and it can be used as a decoy for one of the rooks. And in the meanwhile, you can take care of the b pawn. So instead, Levon played rook a1, trying to exchange in some way c pawn for the a pawn, and now Hikaru took, and now fg. A very interesting choice, because he might want to get some attack to open up the f file and also to activate the rook to give some checks on g5, h5, and so on. Hikaru took on c7, and now Levon took on a4. But it wasn't so. There was a better way to defend this position, and that way was rook f5 immediately. And now in case of doubling on the 7th rank, which seems very logical to attack the g pawn, black can give a check, king h2, and now rook f1. A very, very paradoxical move, because you give up the pawn on g7 with check, and you put your king in much bigger danger. Let's say this, but it appears to be that white cannot avoid perpetual by rook f2 and some checks on the f file. So let's say if you go here, here, you can only give checks. You don't have time for a move like rook c7 or let's say rook d7 because of rook f2, and you have nothing better than that just to move the king up and down. You lose the pawn and then it's a simple draw. So with this rook f1 move, it forces white to go back to c2 and then to go rook fg1. Now there is a threat of some perpetual mechanism by rook from g5 to g2 and going back to g5, threatening both checkmates on h5 or h1. So white would have to bring his other rook to defense by rook e5, and after this king h3. Now luckily for white, black doesn't have rook g5 back to threaten some checkmates, but he has g5, which can be quite annoying because now h5 might come with g4 next, and white can easily go wrong here because let's say if you start pushing the pawn, if you just be greedy with d5, now there is h5, and after rook d2, let's say, to support this pawn, there is check. And after all this, black has a very nice move which wins on the spot. King h6, stopping king g5 as an escape, and now you have these two checks at the disposal, and white can only do a move like rook e6, after which you play g6 and block the check, or you have king h5, but I think after a couple of more checks it's just over because A, there's no more checks, and also B, black is going to give a checkmate on the next move, or just white has to give up the rook. So it's very easy to go wrong here, and white can go rook c2 here. After which again h5 can be played, and now rook e1, forcing the exchange of one pair of rooks. And now after this, you cannot capture like this because you lose the f-pawn and it's much easier to defend, but it's better to go king g2. And after this, to take king h6, and then take on a4, and in the end we'll have something like white can give up the d-pawn for the b-pawn, and let's say rook d6, king g5, d5, rook d4, but I think this is also a fairly easy draw because the king is tucked in. Let's say if you try the typical way to make it to win the position after this b7, I think this is fairly simple to draw, because there's the h-pawn as a huge resource. No, but I think sorry, I'm so sorry. After this, you don't play g6. I think g6 is a mistake because let's say if you play g6, b6, rook b5, b7, now the king is stuck on g5 and you cannot go back to h6 or f6 because there's a check. And also, what's the issue with this? Well, if you just shuffle your rook like this, I go king g3, and now I want to go f4 next to kick the king out in the open to be available for checks. And black has to play something like h4, but after king h3, this appears to be a Zugzwang. Or is it? After this? Yeah, I think it is, because after this, what do you do? If you go rook b4, now I give a check, and the only way to go is king g4. You cannot capture with the rook, you cannot capture with the king because of check on f8, but now there is f5 as a move. And if you take with the g-pawn, there is rook g8, If you take with the king, rook f8 check, and white takes the queen. So I think what should happen here is after this, we should just go back to g6 or h6. Let's say g6, and after this to go rook b5, and after b7 to go just king h7 or whatever. King h7, then g5, and I think this should be a draw. Fairly easy. Okay, I went too far here, but I think it's very instructional to... very useful to know this one. And let's go back to the game, shall we? Levon took on a4, now d5 by Hikaru, and now rook a8. And here I think it was best to go from behind to defend like this. Rook a1, and if you push the pawn, then to go rook d1. And now if this happens, just to go rook g8, and in this case to go g5 and to make luft for the king and to support the defense against the d pawn. Go rook d8 next to get this rook stuck on the 7th rank, and then just to attack the rook on e7. That seems like the good way to defend this position. But Levon played this move, and now Hikaru plays rook e7. I think that here it was best to go d6, because now there's no time for rook a2, rook d2. Because if you go here, then there is this move, and if this happens, rook c8, and black just loses the rook. So black has to defend like rook a d8, but now there is this move. And after some luft like h5, there is d7. So this immediately was played, and after h5 he went for d6, and this was the best way. Rook a2 was the best way to go, but Levon played rook f5 instead. Although here, after rook a2, d7, rook d2, you can take on g7, and black is a pawn down, and he still has to defend against the d pawn. So it's not ideal, but it looks like the most resistant. He went for this, Hikaru took, and now rook h7, king g5, and now the d pawn runs. Now you have to go rook d5 to defend against rook c8, and yeah, black always has this defensive trick. If white goes rook c8, there is this. And now you take on d7, he takes on c8, and it's holdable for black. So white has to find a way to override this trick. And by that, Hikaru meant playing f4. So now, if king takes, there is rook c8. And if black goes rook takes d7, there is this check. Tricking black with this Zwischenzug, and on the next move he takes on d7. So after f4, black has to hide. He chose h4, And now Hikaru went for rook g7. Although here there was a nice move by white. A nice option which could finish the game much quicker. And that's to play f5. Now the point is the same. The king gets naked and it gets under some rook c4 threats. So if you take on f5 like this, again there is rook c8. And if you take on d7, again this check like a Zwischenzug, and when you go back you lose the rook. And also after f5, if king goes back, now there is f6. And now we have white has two passed pawns, which are both quite dangerous. And again, if king takes f6, rook c8. And after capturing, rook c6 wins the rook. So after king h4, he chose rook g7, which was also fine, but it complicates things somewhat. Rook a4, rook c8, rook a d4, and now he took on g6. And now Hikaru's point was after this to play rook c1 to force the exchange of one set of rooks, because there is rook h1 checkmate threat, so it has to be played. Takes, takes, and now he took on b6. Now he has two extra pawns, but very soon it's gonna be only one, but it's enough to win the game, for sure. Black chose to play king g4 to at least capture one of them, but now rook b8, king f4 and b6. Rook d7 by Levon, because if he chose to play rook b8, rook b1, there is b7, and on the next move, white gives a check with the rook. Depends on where the king goes, and promotes on the next move. So he chose to defend on the 7th rank, to somehow meet b7 by rook f7 and to stop checks. And actually I think this position is a draw after this, but at least it's very complex to win this. But of course Nakamura doesn't fall for this, and after rook d7 he chose to give a check, after which well, now I realized I didn't input the whole game. Well, that's quite unfortunate. Crickets. Aha, so after king e4, here he went for rook f3 and resignation was signed. Because now white wants to go rook b3 and then to push the pawn. And what can black do? Well, apparently nothing, because that's why Levon resigned actually. What to do? If you block the pawn, you just have rook b3. And if you begin to activate the king, you can just play f4. And then in case of king going to c6, just to push the f pawn and then to somehow stop the trade of rooks. So yeah, that's it. After this, rook f3, if you block rook b3, and if you try to keep the king to block the f pawn at least, white is just going to simply slowly push the king with the rook and then to advance with the king and repeat the process for many moves, but eventually the process is going to lead to first losing the h-pawn as a potential counterplay, and second of all to advance the f-pawn, which leads to promotion, because White's king has to defend both the queen side, where the king might enter and attack this rook on b7, and second of all to defend against f-pawn. So it's impossible to hold this, and that's simply why Levon resigned. And after round 4, Oparin is leading after with 2.5 points. Both Nakamura and Levon are behind him with 2 points, and it's gonna be a really interesting fight, which we'll have tomorrow. So that's it. Thank you so much for watching this, and see you very soon. Bye bye.